to begin with today's pattern, this is the front pattern and I already made the bust radius. So to achieve the bust radius, I measured from the apex point, which is the fullest part of the bust, to under bust. So you measure yours, and whatever measurement you get, you measure it all round, and that is how you achieve the bust radius. So from here, what I'm going to do now is to contour the neckline, the armhole, and the waist to remove excess fabric from there. So to do that, I would make a straight line from the neckline from the apex point to anywhere on the neckline, and also to the armhole from the apex point. And then at the waist, I would go out half of an inch on both sides of the dart, and also at the center front. But first I would make my bust line, which runs through the apex point or the center of the bust radius. So on the center front, on the bust radius, I would go out 1/4 of an inch on both sides of the line. Then I would also go out 1/4 of an inch on the neckline contour line, and then 1/4 of an inch at the armhole contour line. So now I'll join all of the marks to form a line from the apex point to the bust radius, and then from the bust radius to the armhole, like this. So I'll do that for all the contour lines. And also for the waistline, I will make a line from the apex point to the 1/2 inch mark, and then to the waistline. So now here are all the contours that I have made on this pattern: on the waist and under bust, at the center front, at the armhole, and the neckline. What I'm going to do now is to use the curve to smoothen out that sharp curve or corner on the waist dart a little bit, and from there I'll cut out my waist dart. After the waist dart has been cut, I'll then close the shoulder dart. You see that it will move to the waist dart and make it a little bit wide. You can also transfer that dart to the armhole and then make an armhole dart, or connect it to form a princess dart. So I'll move on and close the center front contour, and then with the armhole contour line, I'll slash through the line and then put it on top of the 1/4 inch and use my adhesive tape to close it, and repeat the same process for the neckline contour. So what I'm going to do now is to correct the neckline, since it has been distorted a little bit. It doesn't affect it in any way, so I'll just smoothen it out. And then once that is done, I'll go down the neckline 1 inch. You can even go more if you want. So I went 1 inch, and then I would make the curve like that, 1 inch, and then from there I'll measure how wide I want my neckline to be. So I want it to be 5.5, so divided by 2, then I'll mark it there. So I'll come up about 3 inches from the center line, and then from there I'll mark my upper bust, which is 11 divided by 2, which is 5.5, and then at the armhole I'll go down 3 inches. And then at the side I took away 1/2 inch like I usually do. This is to take off the ease from the bodice block, and as I always say, I already have allowance on this pattern, so I'm just marking my allowance. So if you don't have allowance, don't do it, you can add your allowance later. So after my allowance has been marked, I will just mark where the 3 inches at the armhole is, and then I'll connect those lines from the neckline to the upper bust, then to the armhole. You can see what I'm doing. So from the neckline, then to the upper bust, and then to the armhole. So once that is done, I would add allowance at the neckline. I would add 1/2 inch allowance on the neckline and at the armhole. So I'll just cut out the unwanted part, and if you want, as I already said, you can also put an armhole dart over there, but that is not what I am going for, but you can add that if you want. It's a personal choice. So for the back, as usual, I'll make a straight line through the dart, and then I would measure the center of the new line and then make my new dart from there. Then from the side, I would take away 1/2 inch as usual from the side and cut it out, and then also mark my allowance over there. And then I'll fold in the dart and then use my adhesive tape to hold it down. From there, I would use the side of the front pattern to measure the side for the back, since I want the length to be the same. So, or you can just come down 3 inches like we did for the front armhole, and then from there you can draw in your back neck depth. So you can go as lower or as high as you want. So this is how low I want mine. So once that is done, I would cut it out, and I have to add a zip extension to the center back, so I would add 1 inch. So I would add an extra paper and then mark my 1 inch zip extension. And that would be it for the back. So these are the patterns for the front and the back. And for the neck, I'll be making a collar, a long collar that I would tie at the back, but then I wouldn't make a pattern for that. I will cut it straight on the fabric, so you see that. So this is the fabric I'll be using. It's a bi-stretch fabric, and it's called bi-stretch because it stretches on both sides. It doesn't have a lot of stretch, it has a little bit of stretch, and it's a bit heavy, not so light. I really like the texture. It makes sewing also really easy because you don't have to iron the whole time. So my front pattern has been laid, and I added 1/2 inch at where the dart was cut out. So if you don't add your allowance, you wouldn't have any space to sew and your measurement would reduce. So I would cut the back, and the back I made it dartless. You can see that I've folded the dart on the pattern, so there is no need to sew at that. And this is what I'll be doing for the neck. I would cut a piece of fabric on the bias or diagonal across the grain, however you want to call it, and then I would mark about 4.5 inches, and then the length depends on you. You can cut as long as you want so that you can have like extra fabric at the back when you tie it. So once the 4.5 inches has been measured, I would cut it out. I'll be folding it in half like this and stitch it. So yeah, so once everything has been cut, you can see I did cut 2 of the front and then 4 of the back. So one will act as the lining, and then I also did cut another piece of fabric for the neck because I wanted it to be long. And for the skirt part, I did cut a length of 21 inches and then the width of, I don't remember, but as long as you want. So I did cut 2 rectangles like that, one for the front and one for the back. And what I did for the front part is to iron an interfacing or attach an interfacing to one part of it. So yeah, and then the other side without, you can also add it if you want. It's just a choice. So what I will do now is to pin the darts for both of the front pieces and then go to my machine and stitch them all. So once the dart has been stitched, I will just trim it down and top stitch it. This is also optional. You can see the top stitch makes it look really nice. So once that is done, I would stitch the sides together like you see, and I will trim down my side seam allowance. And also with the side seam allowance, as I always say, it's a choice. I don't like large seam allowances. So yeah, so what I'm going to do now is to stitch the armhole to the back. So I'll pin it down and then go ahead to the machine and stitch it. So here is how it looks after stitching, and remember to make your understitch on the lining fabric, and this will allow the lining fabric not to roll out. So this is how it looks now. So I'll set aside the top piece and move on to the skirt part. So I will stitch both sides, and then once that is stitched, I will slash through the mid part of one side of the skirt, and then that would be the center back. And once that is done, now it's time to run my gather stitches. You can use your sewing machine to run 2 basting stitches, but I would be hand sewing it since that is much faster and easier for me. So yeah, it's easier for me because most of the time when you do it on the machine, it's the thread sometimes breaks and you have to do it again. But with this thread is much thicker because I fold it into 2. So once that is done, I would make sure the length is up to my waist measurement plus allowance. So you see that there is a seam at the side, so I'll make sure the middle part is half of my waist measurement from seam to seam. So I make sure it's half of my waist measurement, which is 14 because my total waist is 28. And then I'll make sure the other halves measures 8 inches, so it's 7 plus 1 inch of allowance on both sides of the center back. So I guess you understand what I mean. So the mid part will be 14 inches and then the other sides will be 7, and 7 plus 1 inches for allowance. So once that is done, I would attach my front piece, so side seam to side seam, you can see, and then I'll pin the rest to the back. So if you did the measurements right, you wouldn't have any extra thing overlapping. And once that is done, I stitched it and used my zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges. So you can use a serger if you have one. So now it's time to attach the zipper, and what I would do is to pin the center back so that everything is aligned, and then I will stitch a line. I will stitch from where I want the zip to end like that, and then I will go and stitch my zipper. So once the zipper is attached, you can see that the center back seam is aligned. So if you did it well, it should align. I'll go ahead and do my hem, stitch my hem, and then now it's time to attach the collar. So I went ahead and stitched that joint together, and then at the ends I will just slash or cut a diagonal line over there to give it that bow effect once it has been stitched. So what I'll do now is to fold the piece in half and then measure or notch it at the center, and then from the center I'll measure half of the neck measurement, which is 2 3/4, and then once that is done I'll open the piece and pin it like this. I'll fold it in half and pin the notches, and then once that is done I will go ahead and pin the whole strap or the collar. And then what I'm going to do is to stitch from the notches to the end on both sides, and once that is also done I'll go ahead and snip the corners to give it a sharp finish once it has been turned upside down, and I'll use my loop turner to bring it inside out or to turn it inside out. So I use the pin also to kind of push or bring out the corners a little bit to make it look sharp and nice. So once that is done, I forgot to snip that notch over there, so I turn it inside and snip it a bit to the allowance, the size of the allowance. So once that is done, I will bring that allowance out. You can see, so the total length should be the size of your neckline. So I'll pin one side to the neckline, right sides facing, and then go ahead and stitch it. And once that is stitched, I'll snip it to ease it up a little bit because of the curve, and I would also turn in the rest of the allowance on the other side, pin it, and then I'll be using the stitch in a ditch method. So I'll turn over to the right side or the front side and stitch in groove that is there, and this is how it looks. So I'll go ahead and give it a nice press, and then you see the difference after that. This is how the dress looks. It is done. I really love how it turned out, and especially with the fabric, I love the texture. It gives the whole dress a kind of special look. So this dress can be worn as a bridesmaid dress, a wedding guest dress. I mean, you can literally wear this dress everywhere. So yeah, if you like this tutorial, you know what to do, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.